September 27th, 1964, 10:32 in the morning. Boscombe Down Airfield in Wiltshire, England. Roland Beaumont sat in the cockpit of XR-21943, years old decorated fighter pilot from the Second World War, with 14 confirmed kills to his name. He had flown Hawker Typhoons over Normandy, survived flak that had torn apart better men, and walked away from crashes that should have killed him. But this morning was different. Below him, two Bristol Siddeley Olympus 22R engines rumbled with barely contained violence. Their history was written in fire and shrapnel. 14 major malfunctions between December 62 and July 64. Turbine blades had shattered into shrapnel. Combustion chambers had erupted into flames. One explosion had been violent enough to completely destroy the Avro Vulcan testbed aircraft carrying it, turning 60,000 pounds of bomber into confetti over the English countryside. The final test bench failure had occurred just 2 months ago. The engines mounted beneath Beaumont were only partially cleared, deliberately derated, to reduce the probability that the Olympuses would tear themselves apart. This was not reassurance. This was acknowledgement of danger. And then there was the undercarriage, a nightmare of hydraulic complexity that had refused to retract properly in ground testing. British engineering at its most optimistic, its most ambitious, its most fragile. 3 days earlier, someone had asked Beaumont whether he would actually risk flying this aircraft. His answer had been measured. Careful, the kind of answer a man gives when he knows the truth but cannot afford to say it plainly. Given the enormous political pressure surrounding the program, he would accept the risk. For one flight only. They could run the engines at full power for takeoff for perhaps the first 2 minutes. After that, they would need to throttle back, or risk losing the aircraft entirely. The program could not afford another delay. Beaumont reached forward and fired up the engines. 15 minutes later, he brought XR-219 back down to Earth. The aircraft had flown exactly as predicted. Everything had worked, well, everything except the violent undercarriage vibration that had briefly blurred his vision during landing, rattling his skull like dice in a cup. But that could be fixed. 24 test flights would follow over the next 6 months. On Flight 14, February 22nd, 1965, Beaumont took XR-219 supersonic for the first time on a single afterburner, even managing to outrun the Lightning chase plane sent to monitor him. 6 weeks later, cutting torches reduced most of the TSR-2 fleet to nothing more than piles of scrap metal. This is not a story about an aircraft. This is a story about why the British Empire fell. The unraveling had begun nearly a decade before that first flight in the autumn of 1956, when Britain still maintained the infrastructure of a superpower, but no longer possessed the resources to sustain it. November 1956. In a secretly coordinated operation, Israeli forces invaded Sinai while British and French forces occupied Port Said in Egypt, attempting to seize back control of the Suez Canal after President Nasser had nationalized it. The military operation succeeded brilliantly. Paratroopers dropped. Naval guns fired. Egyptian positions fell. The political operation collapsed within days. President Eisenhower was furious. The Americans threatened to withhold International Monetary Fund support, a move that would have crashed the pound sterling overnight and plunged Britain into economic chaos. Other countries joined the assault. Saudi Arabia imposed oil embargoes. The Soviet Union rattled its nuclear sabers, threatening rocket attacks on London and Paris. Within a week, under the crushing weight of American economic pressure, Prime Minister Anthony Eden accepted a United Nations ceasefire. British troops withdrew in humiliation. Denise Healey, then building his reputation as Labour's most formidable voice on defense, watched the crisis unfold with cold, analytical precision. The Suez Affair, he would later write, was a demonstration of moral and intellectual bankruptcy in conception and a political, diplomatic, and operational disgrace in execution. But beyond the immediate humiliation, Suez exposed a harsher reality that British politicians had been avoiding for years. Britain had lost the political position in the Middle East it had taken 40 years to construct. Since World War I, Britain had drawn boundaries, established mandates in Palestine and Iraq, built a network of bases and treaties designed to protect the route to India and secure access to Persian Gulf oil. That entire architecture from the Ottoman collapse through to 1956 fell apart in a single week. Without American support, Britain could no longer act as an independent great power. The economic exhaustion was profound. Liquidating foreign assets and spending sterling balances to finance World War II had left Britain facing what Treasury documents described as appalling difficulties, simply paying for necessary imports. The balance of payments was a recurring crisis. Sterling remained fragile, vulnerable to speculation. Defense spending consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. Yet when Harold Macmillan took office in January 1957, he chose to maintain Britain's nuclear deterrent, keep sterling as a reserve currency, and sustain extensive overseas military forces from Cyprus to Singapore to the Caribbean. The gap between ambition and resources would have to be managed somehow. The Royal Air Force's existing capabilities could not bridge that gap. The English electric Canberra, first flown in 1949 and in service since '51, had been brilliant for its time. It relied on speed, altitude, and maneuverability to evade interception. This concept had worked when the aircraft was conceived because Soviet air defenses could not reach it. Canberras flew too high and too fast for the fighters and anti-aircraft guns of the late 1940s. By the mid-1950s, that advantage was disappearing like morning fog. Soviet surface-to-air missiles were proliferating across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down by an SA-2 guideline missile over Soviet territory, proving that high-altitude flight had become what one RAF assessment grimly called sheer madness. The V-bomber force faced the same vulnerability. The Valiant, the Vulcan, and the Victor Britain's trio of nuclear deterrent aircraft had all been designed for high-altitude operations. When the RAF attempted to shift them to low-level penetration to avoid missiles, the consequences were catastrophic. A Vulcan's airframe life, designed for 3,000 hours at high altitude, dropped to just 300 hours when flown hard at low level. Metal fatigued, wings cracked, the structural margins evaporated. Britain's nuclear deterrent force was aging rapidly with nowhere safe to operate. The future seemed to belong to a different kind of aircraft entirely. High-speed, low-level penetration machines that used terrain to mask their approach, staying under radar coverage, arriving too fast for defenses to react effectively. Suez was not just a political humiliation. It was a technical lesson the RAF could not ignore. The Canberra squadrons deployed to Cyprus in October '56 had operated from proper air bases with prepared runways, maintenance facilities, and logistics support. They had flown high-altitude missions in clear Mediterranean weather against targets the Egyptians could not defend. That kind of war was finished. Britain's global commitments now demanded operations in places where proper air bases did not exist. The Baghdad Pact covered Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization extended obligations to Thailand and the Philippines. NATO required tactical strike capability in Germany. Limited wars could erupt anywhere along this vast arc of responsibility, and Britain's small professional armed forces needed aircraft that could operate from rough forward strips, penetrate defended airspace, and deliver weapons accurately without ground navigation aids. The Canberra could not do it. Too slow at low level, too vulnerable without modern defensive systems, too dependent on proper runways and extensive ground support. The V-Force could not do it either. These were strategic bombers designed for nuclear missions from established bases, not tactical strike aircraft for expeditionary warfare. Britain needed something the Americans were already building, the F-105, Thunder Chief, an aircraft that could fly low and fast using terrain-following radar and automated navigation systems to survive in defended airspace, plus the ability to operate from rough forward airfields. This was the operational problem the RAF faced in late 1956 when the first formal paper proposing a Canberra replacement began circulating within the Air Ministry. Not a theoretical exercise, an urgent operational requirement driven by harsh lessons from Egypt and the changing nature of air defense. In March 1957, General Operational Requirement 339 was formally drafted, demanding capabilities that had never been combined in a single airframe: tactical nuclear strike, conventional weapons delivery, photo reconnaissance at multiple altitudes, electronic intelligence gathering, all-weather operation without ground navigation aids, Mach 2 or better at altitude combined with high subsonic speed at sea level, a combat radius of 1,000 nautical miles, short field takeoff from forward airstrips needing no more than 3,000 feet of runway. It was without question ambitious, but Britain was broke. Duncan Sandys had a solution to Britain's defense spending crisis: Appointed Minister of Defense in early 1957, Sandys was tasked with what the government euphemistically called a total reappraisal of military capabilities. His mandate emphasized nuclear deterrence and missiles over manned aircraft, reduce expenditure toward a cap of £2 billion by the late 1960s. His April 4, 1957 Defense White Paper made the vision brutally explicit. The era of the fighter pilot was ending. Interceptors would be replaced by surface-to-air missiles. Bombers would eventually give way to ballistic rockets. And Britain's sprawling aircraft industry, with too many companies chasing too few contracts, needed immediate consolidation. Smaller and weaker firms would be forced to merge. Any new contracts would go only to the best combined entities. The shockwave through the industry was immediate and devastating. The Avro 730 supersonic bomber was canceled. The CF-105 interceptor was canceled. The Saunders-Roe SR-177 rocket plus jet fighter was canceled. Entire squadrons disbanded overnight. Derek Wood, chronicling the period's upheaval, noted that more than 30 weapon systems were canceled over a short span of years. The industry faced what Stanley Hooker, then working at Bristol Aero Engines, called a time of great turmoil, rarely equaled in any industry. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1956, Britain had 22 airframe companies, 6 engine groups, and 4 helicopter manufacturers. The ministry's assessment was blunt. The industry was excessively fragmented, with too many design offices duplicating effort and consuming limited resources. Small firms like Blackburn Ferry and Saunders-Roe lacked the resources for modern supersonic projects. The message was clear: merge or disappear. The RAF pushed back hard. Senior officers argued that tactical mobility still mattered, that missiles could not provide flexible response to varied threats, that Soviet bombers would arrive before missile defenses were fully deployed. Sandys relented slightly. He allowed the English electric P-1, which would become the Lightning Interceptor, to continue development. And quietly, one other project, Sirius-2, a requirement for a Canberra replacement that had been formally percolating through the system since late '56. General Operational Requirement 339 became the golden carrot, the last major aircraft contract that might be awarded for years. On September 16, 1957, an extraordinary meeting took place at Shelmach's House in London. Sir Cyril Musgrave, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Supply, faced the assembled heads of Britain's aircraft industry. Lord Caldecote from English Electric, Sir George Edwards from Vickers Armstrongs, Sir Roy Dobson from Hawker Siddeley, Sir Frederick Handley Page, 71 years old, representing the company that bore his name. Representatives from Blackburn, Bristol, de Havilland, Saunders-Roe, and Short Brothers filled the remaining chairs. Musgrave delivered the message with ministerial authority and bureaucratic precision. Following the Defense White Paper, there was no certainty of future military projects except possibly GOR 339. The ministry would only place the contract with a group of firms, or with 2 or 3 in coordination, one acting as leader. Proposals had to indicate which firms each company would associate with. The message to the collective heads of Britain's aircraft industry was unmistakable. For any hope of winning any major aircraft contracts, there would be work for 3, perhaps at most 4 group units. Eventual amalgamation and rationalization were the government's hopes. The RAF Historical Society paper on TSR-2 would later document that Musgrave, speaking for the Ministry of Supply, emphasized the need for consolidation and stated that the only power the department possessed was in the placement of contracts, and it was intended to use this as a means of encouraging the association of firms. The requirements for an ideal association were laid down: diversified military and civil programs, good design capacity including supersonic experience, financial strength. The reaction from the industry was immediate. Questions about design responsibility, future projects, how partnerships would function. But the underlying reality was inescapable. The fragmented industry would be forced into consolidation whether it wanted to or not. The government was using GOR 339 as what Sir George Edwards would later call a golden carrot and a very big stick. Merge or get nothing. Stanley Hooker, who would live through the subsequent consolidation when Bristol Aero Engines merged with Armstrong Siddeley Motors to form Bristol Siddeley's Engines, later summarized the human dimension with characteristic understatement. People in the great pioneering companies of this British industry were passionately proud and loyal to their great names. Powerful emotions had to be eroded if mergers were to succeed. Few could doubt that in the 1950s, Britain had too many aircraft companies and too many military aircraft development programs. It was inevitable that both should sharply diminish. But perhaps Hooker wrote this should have been possible without either suggesting that military aircraft were obsolete or that companies failing to merge should no longer be considered for government contracts. 7 days after the Shellmex House meeting on September 23, 1957, GOR 339 was formally issued to industry. The deadline for submissions was January 31, 1958. 9 companies would respond. This had never happened before. Most requirements drew 5 responses at most. Some drew only 1. GOR 339 pulled in every major aircraft company in Britain, each desperate to win what might be the last significant military contract for years. The assessment group, led by Handel Davies, Director General of Scientific Research for the Air Ministry, with input from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, had never seen anything remotely like it. English Electric's submission alone ran to 3 thick volumes with hundreds of pages filled with wind tunnel data, structural calculations, and exhaustive schematics. Vickers countered with nearly 300 pages of technical specifications and drawings. Avro brought powered bombs and standoff weapons. Bristol proposed a canard delta design. Fairey offered another canard layout. De Havilland submitted structural calculations that did not quite add up. Blackburn pushed the NA-39. It was already building for the Navy. Short Brothers proposed a vertical takeoff platform powered by no fewer than 70 engines. Hawker Siddeley made not 1 but 2 late submissions. Of the 9 companies that responded, only 3 emerged as serious contenders after months of evaluation. English Electric, with supersonic experience from the Lightning program. Vickers, with a reputation for delivering on time and on budget. And Avro, part of the Hawker Siddeley group, with deep delta wing expertise from the Vulcan bomber. The rest were eliminated within weeks. Insufficient facilities, inadequate teams, unrealistic proposals. But even among the 3 frontrunners, no clear winner existed. The assessment group was not looking for the best aircraft. They were looking for the least dangerous winner, politically and industrially. Meanwhile, a much bigger fight was brewing beneath the surface of bureaucratic propriety. In April 1957, months before G339 was even formally issued, the Ministry of Defense sent a letter to Sir Claude Pelly, the controller, within the Ministry of Supply that exposed just how ruthless inter-service warfare could become. The letter proposed canceling Blackburn's NA-39 to save money. The Royal Navy could make do with a developed Supermarine Scimitar, instead cheaper and already in production. The proposal helpfully pointed out that killing the NA-39 would enable the government to eliminate both Blackburn Aircraft and de Havilland Engine Company earlier than planned as part of the industry rationalization. But the real goal was buried deeper in the bureaucratic language. The plan was to demonstrate that the RAF's GOR 339 aircraft could eventually cover all Royal Navy strike commitments, enabling removal of the entire naval carrier fleet. 2 problems solved with 1 aircraft cancellation. The ploy failed. In August 1957, the NA-39 program, which would become the Buccaneer, was allowed to continue. The RAF's case against it had been blunt. Blackburn's aircraft was subsonic at low level, lacked supersonic dash capability, and could not meet GOR 339's range requirements. Whatever its merits for the Navy's maritime role, it was not the sophisticated, high-speed penetration aircraft the operational requirement demanded. But the damage was done. Admiral Louis Mountbatten, first Sea Lord, great-grandson of Queen Victoria, war hero and master of bureaucratic infighting, became what the ministry would later describe as an implacable enemy of GOR 339. Mountbatten believed the future of Britain's nuclear deterrent belonged to the Royal Navy, not to aircraft, not to the RAF. His conviction would prove prophetic. Polaris submarines would eventually replace the V-bombers. Mountbatten's signature became legendary in Whitehall. He would arrive at meetings and slap down 5 photographs of the Buccaneer next to a single image of what would become TSR-2, declaring with theatrical precision 5 of one or 1 of the other at the same cost. The Royal Navy's aircraft could deliver equivalent capability at a fraction of the expense, he argued with relentless consistency. The opposition even extended beyond the walls of Whitehall. When Sir George Edwards toured Southeast Asia promoting TSR-2 to Australia as a potential export customer, Mountbatten followed. He informed Australian officials that he doubted whether TSR-2 would ever enter service, primarily on grounds of cost and complexity. The intervention proved devastating. In March 1964, the Australian Air Minister publicly stated his doubts that the RAF would order 100 TSR-2s, noting that the uncertainty would continue if the present head of the UK Chiefs of Staff remained in authority. This was not unprovoked aggression. It was retaliation. The RAF had tried to kill the Buccaneer and possibly naval aviation entirely to clear the field for GOR-339. Instead, they had created an opponent who would undermine the program at every opportunity for years to come. By March 28, 1958, after months of analysis, the assessment group reached its recommendation. English Electric should lead partnered with Vickers and Short Brothers. The companies were duly informed that their work was first class and that GOR-339 was essentially theirs. This arrangement lasted all of 4 months. On July 8, 1958, Sir Claude Pelly reversed course entirely. English Electric's technical abilities, already praised in the March assessment, were reaffirmed, but management confidence remained in the ministry's careful phrasing, exceedingly tenuous. Sir George Edwards at Vickers, by contrast, inspired complete confidence. Technically strong despite aerodynamic gaps precisely where English Electric excelled. The logic was brutally clear. Vickers would lead, English Electric would support, Short Brothers was eliminated entirely. On July 14th, the Research and Development Board agreed. Short Brothers' name was conspicuously absent from the decision. Then came the meeting that would poison the entire program before metal was ever cut. July 29th, 1958, Shelmex House, London. Aubrey Jones, Minister of Supply, met with representatives from both companies. Lord Caldecote from English Electric and Sir George Edwards from Vickers, along with their respective technical teams. What happened next would be remembered for decades as one of the most catastrophic communications failures in British industrial history. Jones, attempting to explain the government's thinking, made a statement in front of both companies that should never have been spoken aloud. We preferred the English Electric design, he said, but we also preferred the Vickers management. The reaction was immediate and irrevocable. Vickers left the meeting convinced it would be in charge of the entire project, with English Electric reduced to a supporting role. English Electric left believing that the P-17A was the aircraft to be built and that Vickers was merely providing management oversight. Sir Claude Pelly tried to explain that GOR-339 was not about choosing a specific design, but about investigating feasibility and forcing industrial consolidation. It was far too late. Jones had said the quiet part out loud, and the resentment was permanently baked into the partnership before it even began. Handel Davies, who had led the assessment and group, would later admit with considerable unease that the decision had been made to exploit Edwards's management capabilities. Davies noted that this was faithful to the government's line of using the TSR-2 contract to force amalgamation on the industry. But he acknowledged that the outcome had troubled him deeply. Edwards's attention would be divided by the VC-10 airliner, the Vanguard turboprop, and other civil projects, preventing the focused leadership the program desperately needed. Throughout the project to come, English Electric would believe that Vickers had stolen its aircraft. Vickers would believe it had rightfully earned leadership through superior management credentials. The joint company, as one historian would later write, would suffer from Vickers' attitude that it was the boss in any partnership. Short Brothers felt even worse. The company had a written agreement with English Electric from their joint February 58 submission guaranteeing equal work share if either firm won the contract. The government ignored it entirely by reissuing the requirement as Operational Requirement 343, claiming the original agreement no longer applied. Short Brothers was excluded from a design its engineers had helped create. On January 1, 1959, the announcement was made public. The contract for the aircraft that would become TSR-2 would be undertaken jointly by Vickers Armstrongs and English Electric. The work would be shared on a 50-50 basis. A joint project team would be established at Vickers Works at Weybridge. But all subsequent contracts would be placed with Vickers alone. English Electric would be treated as a subcontractor. Design leadership, project management, specialist activities, all controlled by Vickers personnel. The only exception was flight test where English Electric would lead because Vickers had no one with substantial supersonic experience. The engineers at Walton and Weybridge now had 12 months to produce a joint design before metal needed cutting. A 1975 solution using 1960s tools constrained by 1950s politics in service of a 1945 strategic mindset. The trap was set. The marriage was forced. Now they had to build an aircraft that satisfied both companies, assuming, of course, that was still possible. January 1960. The Vickers Design Office at Weybridge, Surrey. George Henson sat at a drafting table surrounded by engineers from two companies that had just spent months trying to prove the other was wrong. He was in his early 50s, a product of Supermarine's glory days, now tasked with what one historian would later call creating a sensible and practical compromise. His technical second-in-command, Freddie Page from English Electric's Wharton facility, brought something Vickers desperately needed: supersonic experience. Real experience, not theoretical calculations. Page's team had made the Lightning fly, had solved the problems of sustained high-speed flight, had learned through trial and expensive error what worked and what killed pilots. Together, these two men were supposed to merge English Electric's P-17 with Vickers Type 571 into a single coherent aircraft. Neither company believed compromise was remotely possible. The design team at Weybridge numbered roughly 40 people, working with drawings from two different companies, operating under two completely different philosophies with no common design baseline to start from. The disagreements began immediately on the first morning and never truly stopped for the next 4 years. English Electric's team at Walton believed with absolute conviction that the P-17 with their delta wing, their aerodynamics, their hard-won Lightning experience had won on pure technical merit. They had the supersonic knowledge. They had the wind tunnel data. They had proven their concept could fly. Vickers believed with equal conviction that Sir George Edwards's management authority and their miniaturization concepts had rightfully earned them project leadership. They had delivered the Valiant V-bomber on time and on budget, something almost unheard of in British military aviation. That track record spoke louder than any wind tunnel test. The ministry had managed the remarkable feat of telling both companies exactly what they wanted to hear, while telling neither what they actually needed to know. From the very beginning, emotions ran dangerously hot. At English Electric, Vickers engineers were seen as arrogant interlopers trying to hijack the Canberra replacement using political connections rather than engineering excellence. At Vickers, English Electric was dismissed as cheeky young upstarts with nothing to their credit but the Canberra and an as-yet unproven interceptor. Vickers had decades of experience. They had built Spitfires, built strategic bombers, built the foundation of British air power. English Electric, still wet behind the ears in Vickers' estimation, had some nerve trying to go it alone. The ministry had forced them to collaborate anyway, creating a partnership nobody wanted and everybody resented. But here is what really made TSR-2 fundamentally different from every British aircraft that had come before it. The complexity was not imposed by physics or by the limits of engineering knowledge. The complexity was manufactured by institutions. Every technical challenge that emerged had a committee attached to it. Every design decision required approval from companies that fundamentally distrusted each other's methods and motivations. Nobody had the authority to impose trade-offs. Nobody could simply say, no, this requirement is unrealistic, we will not pursue it. Derek Wood, the aviation historian who would study the program's management extensively, documented what happened when committees replaced chief designers. On previous British aircraft, designers like Sidney Cammett Hawker would have made firm decisions within half an hour based on experience and engineering judgment, then stuck to those decisions regardless of opposition. The Hunter, the Sea Fury, the designs that had built British aviation's international reputation. These aircraft emerged from individual authority backed by hard-won expertise. One person decided the direction. Everyone else followed that direction or left the project. TSR-2 was categorically different. Committees examined every aspect of the aircraft's development. The committees disagreed on most technical points. No single person could or did take instant decisions based on experience. The management board referred decisions to the systems integration panel. The panel consulted the subsystems committees. The committees formed working parties. The working parties reported back with recommendations. The recommendations were considered at length. New meetings were scheduled to discuss the recommendations. Derek Wood noted that designers of CAM's generation would have been genuinely horrified by this process. They understood instinctively that aircraft design required brutal trade-offs, and trade-offs required concentrated authority. Someone had to decide that this particular requirement mattered more than that one. Someone had to accept the hard truth that you could not have everything simultaneously, that pursuing perfection in all dimensions produced mediocrity in every dimension. On TSR-2, nobody possessed that authority. It became commonplace for 60 people to sit in ministry meetings discussing technical problems for hours without reaching any resolution. At one particularly memorable session, the chairman actually counted 58 attendees. He complained loudly that the number was completely unmanageable and demanded a significant reduction in attendance for future meetings. The next meeting had 61 people. The escalation was structural, not accidental. Each company wanted its specific interests represented at every decision point. Each ministry department wanted oversight of anything touching its bureaucratic territory. Each technical specialism wanted direct input rather than filtered information. The committees that could stop progress multiplied far faster than the engineers who could actually create the aircraft. The first major battle erupted over something seemingly trivial: equipment space. English Electric had provided 225 cubic feet of equipment space in the P-17 design. This was not arbitrary generosity. They had learned harsh lessons from the cramped installations on the P-1 Lightning. Insufficient room for avionics and electrical systems meant maintenance nightmares in the field and severe operational limitations in service. The philosophy was straightforward: give the equipment room to breathe, allow access for repairs, plan for upgrades and modifications. Vickers called this empty air pure waste. Their design allocated roughly 90 cubic feet for the same equipment suite. Equipment bays that would be practically empty, they argued with considerable heat, represented wasted volume that could instead carry additional fuel or allow a reduction in overall airframe size and weight. English Electric's counter-argument was immediate and pointed. Where exactly were the wires supposed to go? Vickers had made no provision whatsoever for cable runs, electrical distribution panels, cooling air ducting, or maintenance access. The equipment itself might fit in 90 cubic feet if you crammed it together, but the supporting infrastructure required space that simply did not exist in the Vickers concept. The dispute consumed weeks without resolution, meeting after meeting, producing nothing but rising frustration. But the equipment bay argument was never really about cubic feet. It reflected fundamentally different design philosophies about how the aircraft would actually be used operationally. English Electric's top-mounted equipment bays were optimized for dispersed operations from rough forward airstrips. Access panels opened from above, meaning equipment would be protected from weather during field servicing. Maintenance could be performed in rain or snow without exposing sensitive electronics to the elements. Internal lighting would not be visible at night, hardly a trivial consideration for an aircraft designed to hide in forest clearings under camouflage netting, while Soviet reconnaissance satellites passed overhead. Vickers' side-mounted access design made maintenance faster and easier at proper air bases with covered hangars and electric lighting. But in the field and combat conditions, it would expose equipment to weather during servicing. Internal bay lighting would be visible for miles at night, a beacon announcing the aircraft's location to any hostile forces in the area. The next battle concerned fuel tanks. Vickers had drawn up a saddle tank positioned directly above the engines, maximizing use of available fuselage volume with elegant geometric efficiency. English Electric's engineers recoiled in genuine horror at the concept. Freddie Page was characteristically blunt. Fuel in close proximity to hot engines meant catastrophic fire risk. The consequences of even a minor fuel leak onto a running engine producing exhaust temperatures above 1,000 degrees did not bear thinking about. The aircraft would become a fireball. The crew would have perhaps seconds to eject before being incinerated. The argument dragged on through multiple meetings with neither side willing to concede the point, and the ministry offering no guidance whatsoever on which philosophy should prevail. Then there was the question of short takeoff and landing performance. The operational requirement explicitly specified short takeoff and landing capability for operations from damaged runways and dispersed sites. This was not theoretical. NATO war plans in the late 1950s assumed that Soviet nuclear strikes would crater most proper runways in Western Europe within the opening hours of any conflict. Aircraft that could only operate from pristine 8,000-foot concrete runways would be useless. Vickers took this requirement with absolute seriousness. They optimized their entire design around it, accepting performance penalties in other areas to ensure the aircraft could get off the ground in 3,000 feet or less. English Electric was profoundly skeptical of the entire concept. Their engineers continued to shy away from too much STOL work, reasoning with cold pragmatism that the aircraft would spend the vast majority of its operational life flying from normal airfields in peacetime and would likely never need the capability in actual combat. History would repeatedly prove this prediction correct. But in 1959, the argument generated intense friction rather than productive agreement. Freddie Page predicted with uncomfortable accuracy that allowing design margins to tighten in pursuit of STOL performance would only lead to serious problems later in the development program. He was absolutely right. Every single technical disagreement reflected the deeper institutional distrust poisoning the partnership. Neither company was objectively wrong about its specific engineering concerns. Both had valid technical arguments backed by real experience. But neither could impose its solution on the other, and the ministry had created no mechanism whatsoever to adjudicate between competing philosophies. In March 1959, Vickers and English Electric had produced a formal agreement on how they would theoretically work together. Vickers was nominated as prime contractor with overall project authority. The joint project team at Weybridge consisted of engineers from both companies, though somewhat English Electric heavy in actual practice, led by George Henson. The initial division of labor split the aircraft into components with brutal simplicity. Vickers would handle the wings, the front fuselage, including the internal bomb bay, the undercarriage, and the equipment installation. English Electric would take responsibility for the remainder of the airframe, the power plant, and the electrical power supplies. This division made perfect bureaucratic sense. Each company would build roughly half the aircraft by value. Work would be shared on an approximately 50-50 basis. Everyone could claim success in the partnership. The fundamental problem was that neither company had actually agreed on which underlying design philosophy would prevail when those philosophies came into direct conflict. After more meetings and more arguments conducted with increasing acrimony, Vickers reluctantly conceded on one critical point. English Electric's Delta Wing was the configuration they would pursue. But if English Electric's wing was going to be used, having Vickers build it made little technical sense. The wing work was formally handed over to the Wharton facility. Then the target itself started moving. The fourth draft of General Operational Requirement 339 had been issued in December 1958. By February 1959, it had already been superseded by new thinking about the threat environment and operational requirements. Operational Requirement 343 emerged in March 1959, and the changes were significant enough to fundamentally alter the aircraft's design parameters. The low-level penetration height was redefined downward. The original specification called for operations at roughly 1,000 feet above terrain. The new requirement specified 200 feet or lower. This was not a minor adjustment that could be accommodated with simple modifications. Flight at 200 feet above ground level at 500 miles per hour demanded completely different structural margins to handle turbulence and bird strikes, different systems integration to manage the workload, and different pilot training to survive the mission. The required speed at 40,000 feet increased from Mach 1.7 to Mach 2.0. The air staff cheerfully described this as a cheap bonus. The thrust was going to be available from the engines anyway, they reasoned, so why not specify higher performance and make the aircraft more capable? The engineering implications of sustained Mach 2 flight were apparently considered secondary to the political appeal of matching American capabilities. Thermal management became vastly more complex. Material selection had to account for much higher temperatures. Structural fatigue analysis had to be completely reworked. Electronic countermeasures capability was added to the requirement. Ferry range increased from 2,000 to 2,500 nautical miles. The load classification number, which determined what sort of runways the aircraft could use, dropped from 40 to 20, meaning the aircraft now had to operate from firm grass surfaces rather than just prepared concrete. A new mission profile appeared in the specification that would haunt the engineers for years. A high-low high profile demanding 100 nautical miles of supersonic cruise at altitude, followed by 200 nautical miles at low level at no less than Mach zero point 0.9. The performance inflation seemed deliberately designed to convince the Treasury that it was absolutely necessary to eclipse many existing aircraft types: the American F-105 Thunderchief, the A-3 Vigilante, the French Mirage 4, even the Royal Navy's Buccaneer still lurking in the background as a potential alternative. Each individual enhancement looked reasonable when considered in isolation. Together, they pushed the design toward the absolute limits of what contemporary technology could achieve and created an aircraft that had to be demonstrably better than everything else flying just to survive the brutal procurement process. The joint project team at Weybridge was not trying to refine an agreed-upon configuration. They were frantically chasing requirements that kept evolving faster than they could respond. That April, the first joint aircraft design emerged from months of intense study and compromise. It combined the P-17's delta wing with the Type 571's fuselage in what should have been a straightforward integration. Freddie Page, heading the English Electric design team at Wharton, had established an informal rule of thumb based on hard experience. If the aircraft ever reached 75,000 pounds maximum weight, it was time to rub out the entire design and start again from first principles. The first joint design weighed in at an estimated 82,000 pounds, fully loaded for a 1,000 nautical mile sortie. They were already 9% over Page's threshold weight before detailed design had even begun, before a single piece of metal had been cut, before any of the optimistic assumptions had been tested against reality. The fuselage had already been extended twice to rebalance the aircraft after integrating the P-17 wing. First 5 feet added to the rear section, plus 2¼ feet forward. Then another foot at the nose and another 2½ feet at the rear. Each extension increased structural weight. Each weight increase required a larger, stronger undercarriage. The larger undercarriage needed bigger wheels to distribute the load. Bigger wheels needed deeper bays to retract into. Deeper bays reduced internal fuel capacity or forced an increase in fuselage cross-section, which increased drag and required more thrust. And on it went in an endless, recursive loop. The fundamental question that never received an honest answer was simple: which requirements could be relaxed to control weight growth before it killed the entire program? The ministry offered at one point to relax the requirement for operations from rough forward airstrips. The companies declined not for engineering reasons, but to maintain internal political pressure on the design teams. Any admission that requirements could not be met would invite devastating questions about whether the entire specification was realistically achievable. The weight spiral had begun, and the institutional machinery had no mechanism whatsoever to stop it. In November 1959, Vickers and English Electric produced detailed production plans and cost estimates for formal submission to the Ministry of Supply. The documents landed in Whitehall like an artillery shell. The magnitude of the technical and industrial task was far greater than anyone had predicted. Cost estimates for getting the first aircraft to flight-ready condition had climbed from £35 million to £62 million, nearly double the original figure that had been used to justify the program politically. English Electric estimated 44 months from formal authorization to proceed until first flight. Vickers estimated 40 months. The lower figure was the one quoted to the ministry. Optimism, it seemed, remained the preferred currency in all dealings with Whitehall, regardless of engineering reality. The ministry officials who received these revised figures were genuinely shocked. But the institutional machinery had no mechanism to ask the fundamental question: whether the specification itself might be the underlying problem. John Ragg, the project engineer in charge of engine development for TSR-2 at Bristol Siddeley, would later summarize the systemic dysfunction with brutal clarity. The system had no mechanism for rejecting unrealistic demands. The RAF could not accept reduced capability without undermining the entire justification for why TSR-2 was needed in the first place. The Treasury could not provide unlimited funding without completely abandoning any pretense of cost control. The industry could not admit which requirements were genuinely unrealistic without risking immediate program cancellation. The ministry could not impose technical discipline without publicly acknowledging that Operational Requirement 343 was overspecified from the beginning, so the cost climbed relentlessly. the weight grew inexorably. And everyone blamed everyone else while the aircraft slowly took shape on paper. Early in 1960, the wind tunnel data accumulating on Freddie Page's desk at Wharton simply did not add up to a flyable aircraft. The wing that had looked so promising in initial calculations was behaving badly with flaps deployed. Months of testing had consumed time the program absolutely did not have. Stability problems that should have been conclusively solved kept returning in different forms. The joint project team tried everything: enlarging the tailplane, adding ventral fins beneath the rear fuselage, shifting the center of gravity forward and backward. Each attempted fix introduced new complications elsewhere in the design. The breakthrough, when it finally came, required abandoning one of the original design features entirely. The wing had been designed with anhedral, a downward droop from root to tip, because it helped counteract the natural tendency of swept wings to roll when side-slipping. This was aerodynamically elegant and theoretically sound. It was also causing absolute havoc with the tailplane's effectiveness. The problem was interference. The wing drooping downward and the tailplane mounted low in the rear fuselage meant the two surfaces were simply too close together vertically. Airflow disturbed by the wing was hitting the tailplane, directly causing it to behave unpredictably at critical angles of attack. The most direct fix was to increase the vertical gap between the two surfaces. That meant eliminating the wing's anhedral, entirely making the underside completely flat, with only a shallow angle remaining on the upper surface from the natural thickness taper. The trade-off was significant and immediate. Without anhedral, the aircraft became highly susceptible to Dutch roll, that unpleasant coupled yawing and rolling motion that makes even experienced combat pilots uncomfortable and nauseous. But the stability gains from separating the wing and tailplane justified accepting the Dutch roll problem. They would deal with it separately through the auto-stabilization system. To recover the lift lost in flattening the wing, the outer wing's leading edge gained a forward extension with a distinctive notch cut into it, creating a sawtooth pattern along the leading edge. This was supposed to improve airflow characteristics at higher angles of attack and restore the lost lifting capability. Combined with a 30-degree drooped extension along the wing's leading edge and the largest flap and tailplane configuration, yet tested, this modification produced the best results the wind tunnel had seen in months. But the sawtooth extension was about to become the design's single biggest aerodynamic headache. Later testing revealed with horrifying clarity that the sawtooth caused pitch-up, that dreaded and potentially fatal tendency for the nose to rise uncontrollably at certain critical angles of attack. This phenomenon had already claimed the lives of many pilots flying swept-wing aircraft since the early supersonic era. It was not theoretical. It killed people. Even worse, the sawtooth was shifting the aerodynamic center progressively forward during transonic flight, meaning it was moving the wing's entire lift balance point forward at precisely the worst time. Combined with weight growth in the engines and the complex reheat system steadily pushing the center of gravity forward, this created a genuine balance crisis. The aircraft was becoming dangerously nose-heavy at high speed and worryingly tail-heavy at rest. The sawtooth had been added specifically to solve one problem. Now it was creating two more serious problems, and there was still the persistent matter of Dutch roll to address. When they had flattened the wing months earlier, the engineers had accepted increased susceptibility to the yawing and rolling motion as an unavoidable price of solving the tailplane interference. The working assumption was that the auto-stabilization system would handle the problem electronically. But accepting a problem's existence and simply ignoring it are fundamentally different approaches. Someone at the Wharton facility proposed a genuinely counterintuitive solution. What if the wingtips themselves could provide the directional stability the flattened wing had lost? Rather than extending the wings outward in normal fashion, the outer portions would turn sharply downward, angling toward the ground like drooping hands reaching for the earth. Wind tunnel models were hastily built and tested through November 1959, with results that forced a critical decision. The downturned wingtips solved the Dutch roll problem without creating new complications. Flap effectiveness barely changed despite the slight reduction in effective wingspan. The structural cost was concentrated at the joint itself, where the angled portion met the main wing structure, making the engineering more complex but not impossibly so. Most importantly, lift losses proved entirely negligible. The sawtooth, meanwhile, was comprehensively failing at its original purpose while making everything else measurably worse. Not everyone believed the wind tunnel data on the downturned tips. Heated arguments erupted over the analysis methodology. The numbers looked suspiciously too good. One senior engineer dismissed the entire report as thoroughly dishonest, extraordinarily strong language in any technical disagreement, but especially pointed when the program's entire future hung precariously on getting the aerodynamics exactly right. The debate dragged on inconclusively with neither side willing to concede. Freddie Page cut through the paralysis with characteristic decisiveness. The sawtooth would be deleted entirely. The downturned tips would be retained. The lift that the sawtooth was supposed to provide would be recovered through a completely different approach, extending the wing's trailing edge rearward by 24 inches at the tip. This recovered the necessary lift without the pitch-up problems, without the balance complications, without the weight penalty. It was a complete package deal. Delete the feature that was demonstrably failing. Keep the feature that was actually working. Solve the original aerodynamic problem through an entirely different technical approach. In late March 1960, a design freeze finally locked in these hard-won changes. The TSR-2 wing had at last taken on the distinctive shape that would become its most recognizable feature. Sharp delta platform, completely flat undersurface, dramatic downturned wingtips reaching toward the earth. It was beautiful, it was unconventional, and it had taken 18 months of brutal argument to achieve. The design team's approach to the fuselage managed to avoid a fundamental trade-off that other designers had simply accepted as unavoidable. There existed an aerodynamic principle called the area rule discovered by Richard Whitcomb working for NACA in the early 1950s. The area rule stated in deceptively simple terms that an aircraft's supersonic drag depended critically on how smoothly its total cross-sectional area changed along its length. Add a conventional wing to a cylindrical fuselage, and you created a sudden bulge in the area distribution curve. That bulge produced a massive drag penalty that could prevent an aircraft from going supersonic entirely. The Convair F-102 Delta Interceptor had proven this point with painful clarity. The aircraft was specifically designed to be supersonic. The prototype could not break Mach 1, topping out at a humiliating Mach 0.98. Only after Convair engineers pinched the fuselage into a distinctive wasp-waisted shape, the famous Coke bottle look, did the aircraft finally achieve supersonic flight. But that solution cost precious internal volume, exactly where fuel tanks and weapon bays desperately needed to go. The TSR-2 design elegantly solved this problem by stretching the wing roots deep into the fuselage itself, blending the two components into a single integrated aerodynamic shape. The cross-sectional area changed smoothly and continuously along the aircraft's entire length, meeting the area rule's requirements without requiring any Coke bottle pinch that would sacrifice internal volume. 80% of the total fuel load went into integral fuselage tanks. Forward tanks stretched from the equipment bay back to the engine air intakes. Rear tanks wrapped efficiently around the engine installation tunnels. The wings themselves carried the remaining fuel. Total internal tankage reached approximately 5,500 gallons, giving the aircraft the combat radius that Operational Requirement 343 had specified. The flying control surfaces abandoned convention entirely in pursuit of authority across an enormous flight envelope. An all-moving tailplane mounted low in the rear fuselage handled both pitch control and roll control simultaneously. The two halves could move together for climbing and diving or differentially for banking and turning. The engineers called them tailerons, a portmanteau that captured their dual function. There were no conventional ailerons on the wing itself. The tailplane did absolutely everything. The vertical fin was all moving as well. No conventional rudder at all. The entire surface pivoted on a massive hinge. This revolutionary arrangement gave the aircraft genuine control authority across a huge flight envelope from 200 feet terrain, following at high subsonic speed and all the way to Mach 2 flight above 50,000 feet. But it also meant the aircraft was fundamentally inherently unstable in certain critical flight regimes. Without constant electronic assistance, pilots would struggle merely to keep it pointing where they wanted to go. The auto-stabilization system was supposed to handle this automatically. Gyroscopes would sense any unwanted motion. Computers would instantly command the appropriate corrections. The control surfaces would respond smoothly before pilots even noticed a problem developing. Whether the system would actually work as intended remained very much an open question as 1960 turned to 61. The Vickers and English electric design teams had created something genuinely extraordinary by any reasonable engineering measure. The wing worked brilliantly across the speed range. The control surfaces provided adequate authority from treetop height to the stratosphere. The blended fuselage held together aerodynamically without the performance compromises other designers had simply accepted as inevitable. But an airframe remained nothing more than an empty shell until you filled it with systems. The navigation system that would guide this aircraft precisely to its target at extreme low level, in complete darkness and terrible weather, existed mostly as detailed specifications and hopeful supplier contracts. Terrain following radar, the single system that justified the entire low-level penetration concept, was absorbing 40% of the total electronic development budget and still had not flown successfully in any aircraft. Nobody in British aviation had ever attempted to integrate 14 major avionics systems into a truly coherent whole and at anything approaching this scale of complexity. The computers being painstakingly built were only the very beginning of that monumental challenge. And Bristol Siddeley's Olympus engines, which were supposed to reliably deliver 30,000 pounds of thrust in full reheat, kept delivering compressor blade failures, combustion instabilities, and catastrophic explosions instead. The weight would inevitably start climbing again. Every system that progressed from hopeful specification to actual hardware came in heavier than predicted. Fixes and modifications added more structure. Additional structure demanded more fuel to maintain the required range. More fuel demanded yet more structure to carry that fuel safely. More weight. Once started, the spiral developed a terrible momentum entirely of its own. What the exhausted engineers could see on their drawing boards, scattered across Weybridge and Wharton, was perhaps the most sophisticated combat aircraft any country had yet attempted to design and build. But technical brilliance on paper meant nothing without the systems to make it fly and the political will to see it through. How Britain's deeply flawed industrial and political system would actually deliver it remained the great unanswered question. The engines kept exploding. The electronics barely existed. The weight was spiraling out of control. The forced partnership remained dysfunctional. The Treasury was watching every pound with alarm, and the politicians were sharpening their knives. Between Roland Beaumont's first flight in September '64 and the cutting torches 6 months later, a perfect storm of technical challenges and political forces would converge to destroy what the engineers had created. To understand why an aircraft that worked was deliberately destroyed, we need to examine the problems that never stopped accumulating. Bristol Siddeley's facility at Filton had become a place of recurring nightmares between 1962 and '64. The Olympus 22R engine was an evolution of the power plant already successfully flying in the Vulcan strategic bomber. The development should have been relatively straightforward, building on proven technology and accumulated experience. It was anything but straightforward. TSR-2 needed engines capable of delivering 30,000 pounds of thrust in full reheat while maintaining reliability across an enormous operating envelope. From sea-level operations in tropical heat to sustained high-altitude supersonic cruise, from rapid throttle movements during the terrain-following flight to smooth acceleration through the transonic region. The catalog of failures became grimly familiar to everyone involved. The failure modes were devastatingly varied and the consequences increasingly severe. In July 1964, just 2 months before Beaumont's first flight, the final test bench failure occurred. The engines that were eventually installed in XR-219 for that first flight were only partially cleared, deliberately operated at reduced power settings to minimize the probability of self-destruction. John Ragg, the project engineer in charge of engine development at Bristol Siddeley, would later summarize the challenge with characteristic understatement. We were pushing the absolute boundaries of what turbojet technology could achieve in the early 1960s. The thrust levels demanded were at the very edge of contemporary material science. Every incremental increase in operating temperature meant new exotic alloys, new sophisticated cooling schemes, new unpredictable failure modes. The original engine development budget had been conservatively optimistic. The reality proved brutally different. Costs were exploding even faster than the test engines themselves. Each failure demanded complete redesign of affected components. New testing consumed more time. More time meant more money. More money meant increased Treasury scrutiny. Every engine problem gave fresh ammunition to TSR-2's growing army of enemies. If they cannot even get the engines working reliably, the argument went, how can we possibly trust them with the entire aircraft system? The avionics challenge made the engine problems look almost manageable by comparison. TSR-2 required the successful integration of 14 major avionics systems into a coherent whole. Terrain-following radar, forward-looking radar, sideways-looking radar for reconnaissance, inertial navigation, Doppler navigation for position updates, head-up display for the pilot, auto-stabilization preventing the inherently unstable aircraft from departing controlled flight, flight control computers, weapon aiming computers, electronic countermeasures to jam enemy radars, radar warning receivers, communications suite, identification, friend or foe transponder, data link for coordinating with ground controllers. The terrain-following radar was the single most critical system in the entire aircraft. It justified the entire low-level penetration concept that distinguished TSR-2 from every other aircraft flying. The system's function was conceptually simple but technically extraordinary. Continuously scan the terrain ahead using radar. Compute a safe flight path, avoiding obstacles and maintaining precise altitude above ground. Feed steering commands directly to the autopilot. Keep the aircraft exactly 200 feet above the ground at over 500 miles per hour in complete darkness and terrible weather without any pilot input whatsoever. This terrain-following radar was absorbing 40% of the entire electronic development budget and still had not flown successfully in any operational aircraft by late '64. The technology was theoretically sound. Scientists at the Royal Radar Establishment had proven the fundamental concepts, but the system remained immature, unproven years away from reliable operational service. It would need to be integrated and debugged after the aircraft entered flight testing, adding risk and delay to an already troubled schedule. The flight computers themselves were revolutionary for the time, yet primitive by any modern standard. Transistorized circuits rather than integrated chips. Magnetic core memory, analog computing for certain time-critical functions. But they represented a genuine revolution in aircraft systems. Digital flight control, automated navigation, integrated weapon aiming. Nobody in British aviation had ever attempted systems integration at this scale of complexity. Each major system was being developed by a different contractor working largely in isolation. Ferranti handled the navigation computer and inertial platform. Elliott developed the autopilot and flight control computer. Marconi provided the various radars. Decca supplied Doppler navigation. Coordinating all these independent contractors and their competing technical approaches into one coherent system that actually worked reliably was proving to be an absolute nightmare of management and engineering. The specification had demanded that no single failure should prevent the crew from bringing the aircraft safely back to base. Every system needed redundancy. Every critical component needed backup. Every failure mode had to be analyzed and protected against. The weight implications were staggering. Between 1961 and '64, the numbers climbed with depressing inevitability. The original design target from '59 had been 75,000 pounds maximum weight. The first joint design in April '59 came in at 82,000 pounds, 9% over target, before detailed design had even started. '61 saw detailed design work reveal the aircraft would actually weigh approximately 88,000 pounds, 17% over the original target. 1963 brought production aircraft estimates, climbing to roughly 95,000 pounds, 27% over target. The cascade was relentless and seemingly unstoppable. The electronics that Vickers had promised to miniaturize into 80 cubic feet came in heavier than predicted. The miniaturization concept ran directly into thermal management problems that nobody had adequately anticipated. Equipment bays had to be enlarged to accommodate cooling systems. Wiring harnesses proved heavier than theoretical calculations suggested. The Olympus engines grew heavier with each redesign cycle as components were strengthened to prevent the failures that kept occurring in testing. The airframe structure had to be progressively strengthened as fatigue testing revealed unexpected stress concentrations. Low-level flight at high speed imposed far greater structural loads than initial analysis had predicted. Every reinforcement added weight, every added pound of structure reduced range or required additional fuel. Additional fuel required stronger structure to carry it safely. The spiral continued with inexorable mathematical certainty. Freddie Page's 75,000-pound threshold, his bright red line in the sand beyond which the entire design should be abandoned and restarted, had been passed long ago and left far behind. But they could not start again. Too much had been invested, too much political capital expended, too many jobs dependent on continuation, too many reputations staked on success. The Vickers and English electric teams tried everything possible to control the weight growth, substituting materials aluminum replaced with titanium where temperatures demanded it, redesigning components to reduce mass, optimizing systems to eliminate redundancy where analysis suggested it might be acceptable. Each hard-won weight saving was promptly offset by new additions elsewhere in the design as requirements evolved and problems emerged. In 1962, the Treasury had seen enough. A comprehensive cost review was formally demanded. TSR-2 program costs had climbed from £90 million in the original 59 estimates to over £200 million for development alone by 62. This did not include production costs. This was just getting the first aircraft flying and proven. The questions from Treasury officials were pointed and politically devastating. Is Britain actually getting value for money from this program? Could off-the-shelf American aircraft perform the same mission more cheaply? Can Britain realistically afford to continue developing indigenous military aircraft at all? Dennis Healey, now Labour's Shadow Defense Secretary, at 45 years old, was watching the program's troubled progress with increasing skepticism, born of hard political experience. Healey, who had watched the Suez debacle expose Britain's fundamental weakness, believed with absolute conviction that Britain was attempting to maintain great power, military capabilities on a medium-power economic budget. Something had to give. Either Britain accepted a reduced international role or made genuinely hard choices about what military capabilities to cut entirely. TSR-2 increasingly looked like the prime candidate for the axe. Admiral Mountbatten's relentless campaign of opposition never stopped. His famous presentations continued in meeting after meeting, always the same devastating simplicity. 5 photographs of the Buccaneer aircraft laid next to a single image of TSR-2. 5 of one or one of the other at exactly the same total cost to the taxpayer. The argument was gaining serious political traction. The Royal Navy could provide Britain's nuclear deterrent through Polaris submarines. The RAF's expensive manned bomber force was becoming operationally obsolete anyway. Why spend hundreds of millions on a complex strike aircraft when simpler alternatives existed? In 1963, the United States was developing the General Dynamics F-111, a variable sweep wing fighter bomber that promised similar performance to TSR-2. The American aircraft was already deep into development and testing. It could potentially be purchased off the shelf at significant cost savings compared to completing TSR-2 development. The comparison was politically powerful even if technically questionable. Australia, the most promising potential export customer for TSR-2, was growing increasingly skeptical about the program's viability. Mountbatten's intervention following Sir George Edwards on his promotional tour had proven devastatingly effective. In March 64, the Australian Air Minister was publicly expressing serious doubts that the RAF would actually order 100 TSR-2 aircraft as planned. Without a substantial RAF order, the unit costs would remain prohibitively high. Without reasonable unit costs, export orders would never materialize. The critical export sales needed to make the economics work had effectively evaporated before the aircraft had even flown. October 1964. Harold Wilson's Labour Party won the general election, ending 13 years of conservative government. Dennis Healey became Secretary of State for Defense with a clear mandate: conduct a comprehensive defense review, cut costs ruthlessly, rationalize military capabilities, accept Britain's reduced role in the world honestly rather than pretending otherwise. TSR-2 was the single biggest program in the entire defense budget and the most obvious target for cancellation. The arguments against TSR-2 had been building for years and now reached critical mass. The cost argument was devastating. Development had already consumed over £200 million, with at least $75 million more needed to complete flight testing and certification. The projected unit cost had climbed to over £3 million per aircraft compared to roughly 2 million for the American F-111. For the planned production run of 150 aircraft, the total program cost would exceed 600 million pounds. Credible alternatives existed. The F-111 offered similar performance at lower cost. The Buccaneer, already in operational service with the Royal Navy, was proven and could be upgraded to meet many of the same operational requirements. The strategic necessity was increasingly questionable. Would Britain really fight independent wars requiring TSR-2's unique capabilities? Or would future conflicts be conducted under NATO command using American bases and American logistical support? The arguments in favor of TSR-2 were equally passionate, but ultimately less persuasive to politicians focused on budgets rather than capabilities. The industrial argument emphasized thousands of jobs, British aerospace technological leadership, potential, export sales, maintaining sovereign capability in defense procurement. The military argument stressed that TSR-2 was genuinely superior to any alternative for its specific mission profile. British operational independence mattered. Reliance on American supply chains created unacceptable strategic vulnerability. The political argument invoked national prestige, proof that Britain remained capable of world-class technological achievement. Early in 1965, Dennis Healey was conducting his detailed review, while Roland Beaumont continued the flight test program with mounting success. Flight 14 on February 22nd was a genuine triumph. XR-219 went supersonic on a single afterburner and outran the Lightning chase plane. Performance exceeded the most optimistic predictions. The aircraft was magnificent in the air. The cruel irony was that just as TSR-2 was finally proving itself technically, the political decision had already been made in Whitehall offices far from Boscombe Down. March and April 1965, Whitehall. Dennis Healey presented his case to cabinet with characteristic analytical precision. His recommendation was unambiguous. Cancel TSR-2 immediately. Replace it with a purchase order for 50 F-111 aircraft from the United States. The financial justification appeared compelling on paper. TSR-2 development required another 75 million pounds on top of the 195 million already spent. The F-111 purchase would cost approximately 400 million pounds total, compared to roughly 600 million for completing TSR-2. The apparent savings were significant, though the calculations conveniently ignored cancellation penalties and ignored the industrial and technological costs of abandoning indigenous capability. The strategic argument reflected Healey's fundamental assessment of Britain's realistic position. Britain could no longer afford to maintain an independent global military presence. Future military operations would inevitably be conducted under NATO or American command. The F-111 was adequate for any scenario Britain would actually face. The industrial argument was perhaps the most painful. British aerospace industry had to rationalize and consolidate. It could not sustain large, independent military aircraft programs. Resources would be better allocated to collaborative European projects or to civil aviation. The opposition was fierce and immediate. The RAF was absolutely furious. TSR-2 was demonstrably superior to the F-111 for British operational requirements. The F-111 was being developed for American needs and American operating concepts, not British requirements. Operational sovereignty would be fundamentally compromised. The aerospace industry was devastated. Thousands of highly skilled jobs would be lost immediately. British technological capability, painstakingly built over decades, would be destroyed. Future military contracts would be jeopardized. The conservative opposition attacked the decision as national humiliation, surrendering technological leadership to America. Proof that labor was fundamentally soft on defense. April 6, 1965. Denise Healey rose in Parliament to make the announcement that would be remembered for decades. The TSR-2 program is cancelled with immediate effect. The government will negotiate to purchase F-111 aircraft from the United States to meet the operational requirement. The reaction across the aviation industry was profound shock mixed with disbelief. Even those who had known cancellation was politically likely could not quite believe the final decision when it came. Sir George Edwards would later say the moment felt like a death in the family, sudden and incomprehensible despite warning signs. English Electric saw years of brilliant engineering work destroyed by political expedience. Subcontractors had their contracts terminated immediately without warning. But the decision was not simply to cancel the program and move on. The decision was to ensure that TSR-2 could never under any circumstances fly again. Within weeks of the cancellation announcement, cutting torches were brought to the various facilities where TSR-2 aircraft sat in different stages of completion. Most of the fleet was methodically reduced to scrap metal, not carefully mothballed for potential future use, not preserved as insurance against changing strategic circumstances, actively destroyed with what seemed like bureaucratic vindictiveness. X, or 219. The first prototype that had flown so successfully was eventually preserved and now sits in the RAF Museum at Cosford. XR-220. The second prototype was preserved and now resides at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford. But XR-221, XR-222, XR-223 production aircraft in various stages of assembly were cut up and destroyed. The remaining incomplete airframes were destroyed. The specialized tooling was destroyed. The production jigs were destroyed. The manufacturing facilities were repurposed for other work. The question that haunts every account of the cancellation is simple. Why such thorough destruction? Multiple theories have been proposed over the decades. The Treasury demanded it to ensure no future government could reverse the decision and restart the program. Political insurance to make revival literally impossible. American pressure as a condition of the F-111 deal. Bureaucratic spite from officials who wanted to decisively prove their point. The truth was probably some combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of political calculation and institutional momentum. The human cost was immense and largely invisible to politicians. Freddie Page at English Electric watched the cutting torches with what he later described as a sick feeling in his stomach, seeing years of brilliant work reduced to scrap. George Henson at Vickers said the waste was obscene, not just the money but the talent, the time, the hope invested by thousands of people. Roland Beaumont wrote bitterly about the political assassination of a magnificent aircraft that had proven itself in the air. Thousands of skilled workers lost their jobs. British aerospace lost capabilities it would never fully recover. The irony compounded 3 years later. In 1968, Britain canceled the F-111 order that was supposed to replace TSR-2. The reasons were grimly familiar. Costs had escalated well beyond original predictions. Sterling devaluation made the dollar-denominated purchase unaffordable. The F-111 program itself was experiencing significant delays. Strategic priorities had shifted again. Britain ended up with neither TSR-2 nor F-111. The Buccaneer, the aircraft the RAF had tried to kill back in '57 to clear the field for the Canberra replacement, became the substitute. It was upgraded and pressed into service for roles it had never been designed for. The Buccaneer served admirably for decades, but it was not and could never be TSR-2. British aerospace never recovered the independent capability to design and produce advanced combat aircraft. Subsequent programs reflected the new reality. Tornado was a multinational collaboration that reduced British sovereignty over requirements and design. Typhoon was a European consortium. F-35 is an American program where Britain plays a junior partner role. TSR-2's cancellation marked the definitive end of an era when Britain could independently develop cutting-edge military aircraft from clean sheet design to operational service. The financial question remains genuinely debatable even today. Did cancellation actually save money for the British taxpayer? Approximately £195 million had been spent on TSR-2 development. Cancellation penalties cost roughly £30 million. Investment in the F-111 before that program was also canceled consumed approximately £100 million. Buccaneer upgrades required additional expenditure. The net savings were far less than originally projected and quite possibly negative when all costs were honestly accounted. Britain's global military retrenchment accelerated dramatically after '65. In '68, withdrawal from east of Suez was formally announced. Bases throughout the Middle East and Far East were closed. Global military presence contracted sharply. The regional great power role was abandoned and TSR-2 had been designed for a world Britain was already leaving behind. But the question remains whether cancellation accelerated that strategic retreat or whether the retreat was inevitable, regardless of any single aircraft program. The technical question also persists. Would TSR-2 actually have worked as promised? The evidence strongly suggests yes eventually. 24 test flights were conducted successfully. Flight 14 demonstrated that supersonic performance exceeded predictions. Handling characteristics were praised by Beeman. The system's integration challenges were formidable but almost certainly solvable given time and resources. The counter-argument acknowledges that electronics remained immature. Weight growth was continuing. Costs would have climbed further. Service entry would have been delayed by years beyond original schedules. The likely reality is that the aircraft would have worked and entered operational service, but at substantially higher cost and later date than anyone promised in the optimistic early days. Today, XR-219 sits quietly in the RAF Museum at Cosford. That sharp delta wing, those distinctive downturned wingtips, the blended fuselage that solved the area rule without sacrificing volume. Silent now. Still, undeniably beautiful. Most museum visitors walk past without a second glance. It is a museum after all. There is much to see. Spitfires and Hurricanes and Lancasters command more immediate attention and emotional connection. But some people stop. Some read the small plaque. Some begin to understand what they are actually looking at. The plaque is factual and brief. BACTSR-2, XR-219. First flew September 27th, 1964. Last flew 1965. Canceled April 6, 1965. One of the most advanced aircraft of its era. Never entered operational service. What the plaque cannot convey is the human story. Thousands of people worked on this aircraft for years. Careers were built around it and then destroyed when it died. Political fortunes rose and fell. She represented Britain's final attempt to remain in the absolute first rank of military aviation powers through independent national effort. She flew beautifully in the brief time she was allowed to fly. She was killed anyway. Not because she did not work, not because the engineers failed, not because the design was fundamentally flawed. She was killed because Britain was desperately trying to be something it no longer was. A global superpower with unlimited resources and unchallenged technological supremacy. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is not that you cannot build something magnificent, but that you can no longer afford it. TSR-2's story was not unique in British industrial history. The pattern repeated across multiple sectors through the 1950s and 60s. Blue Streak ballistic missile canceled. Blue Water tactical missile canceled. Blue Steel Mark II standoff bomb canceled. An entire generation of advanced weapons programs killed by the gap between ambition and resources. Britain in the late 50s and early 60s was attempting to maintain the military capabilities of a superpower with the economic resources of a medium-sized power. Something had to give. TSR-2 was simply the most visible and most painful sacrifice. Derek Wood's observation proved prophetic. Complex engineering projects need clear authority and decisive leadership, not consensus-driven bureaucracy. The forced marriage between Vickers and English Electric was probably inevitable given the industry's fragmentation. Britain genuinely did have too many aircraft companies chasing too few contracts. But forcing direct competitors to collaborate while giving neither clear authority was a recipe for dysfunction. Aubrey Jones's catastrophic statement, "We prefer the English Electric design," but the Vickers management poisoned the partnership before it properly began. Industrial consolidation was necessary, but mergers require genuine integration and shared purpose, not bureaucratic mandate imposed from above. The requirement itself was probably the deepest problem. OR-343 demanded everything simultaneously. Mach 2 at altitude and Mach 0.9 at 200 feet. 1,000-mile combat radius and 3,000-foot takeoff capability. All weather operations and no single-point failures. Each requirement was individually reasonable. Together, they pushed technology to its absolute limits and beyond. Nobody in the system could say this is simply too much, we need to accept trade-offs. The RAF could not accept reduced capability without undermining the program's justification. The Treasury could not provide unlimited funding. The industry could not admit requirements were unrealistic. The ministry could not impose discipline. Ministers averaged 1/12 of a typical project's life cycle, but each wanted to leave their mark despite minimal technical knowledge. 3 separate ministries held veto power. No single authority existed with responsibility for success. Long-term complex projects need stable political support across multiple governments, not ministerial churn and bureaucratic fragmentation. TSR-2 was designed for a strategic world. Britain was already leaving. Global bases, independent expeditionary operations, great power conflicts fought without American support. The reality was withdrawal east of Suez, NATO integration, regional rather than global power status. Military platforms must match actual strategy, not nostalgic aspiration. The ultimate irony is that TSR-2 failed not because British engineering was inadequate, but because British engineering was too capable. The designers created exactly what the specification demanded. The problem was that the specification itself was unaffordable, given Britain's actual economic circumstances. Could TSR-2 have succeeded? Technically, yes, eventually. Financially, maybe if costs had been ruthlessly controlled. Politically, no. Britain simply could not afford great power, military ambitions anymore. XR2-20 stands in the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. XR2-19 stands in the RAF Museum at Cosford. Silent witnesses to British engineering brilliance, to political dysfunction, to imperial decline, to institutional paralysis. She never fired a shot in anger, never dropped a bomb in combat, never flew an operational mission against an enemy. But TSR-2's failure taught lessons far more valuable than her operational success might have provided, about the limits of national ambition when resources cannot match aspirations, about the cost of institutional dysfunction when committees replace leadership, about what happens when politics inevitably trumps engineering excellence. She sits in the museum now, beautiful, silent, complete in every detail, a perfect failure. Britain's last great solo flight into a future that no longer existed.